They gave him a virus to make him better at reading people. That was the part he never quite got over. It came in a small ampule, the color of weak tea, administered by a technician who smelled of antiseptic and didn't make eye contact. "You'll feel it in about 40 minutes, she said, like a door opening. She pressed the injection site for a moment and handed him a paper cup of water as though the whole procedure were no more remarkable than a flu shot, and maybe by then, it wasn't. Cale Aduro had used empathy inducers before most compliance investigators did. The augmented intuition helped you read stress signatures, micro-expressions, the particular way guilt settled into a person's posture before it reached their face. The consortium called it a perception aid. Cale called it the feeling of wearing someone else's skin over his own. He sat in the transit pod watching the city approach and tried to focus on the briefing file. 12 stations across the reach had reported anomalous entry patterns. Crew members boarding vessels they had no documented clearance for. Gene locks bypassed. Travel tags, the biometric credentials encoded with each person's full genetic profile, work history, and sector assignment, appearing in the system flagged as valid when any competent inspector could see the underlying sequences had been spoofed. Somebody was counterfeiting passage. Somebody very good. The city was called Meridian, which was the kind of name you gave a place when you wanted it to sound like hope. It was a processing hub for one of the outer extraction rings, which meant the docking towers were massive, and the residential blocks were pale gray and tiered, like sedimentary rock. And the streets at ground level smelled of recycled air and whatever food vendors were cooking in the narrow passages between prefabricated facades. The sky was a particular shade of washed-out amber from the atmospheric processors. Even at noon, it looked like late afternoon. Even late afternoon looked like something ending. Cale had 40 minutes before the virus fully metabolized. He used them to walk the district surrounding the facility he'd been sent to investigate, a mid-tier logistics clearance office called Waypoint 14, and let the augmentation come up slowly, the way you'd let your eyes adjust to a darker room. By the time he stepped through the doors, he could already feel it. The particular frequency of anxiety in a room full of people who knew something was wrong, and were hoping the investigator from Central didn't look too closely. He looked closely. The counterfeiting was elegant. He could see that in the first hour. Whoever was doing it understood not just the encoding protocols, but the biological authentication layer beneath them. The way the gene lock readers cross-referenced not just the tag's embedded data, but the thermal and microbiome signature of the person presenting it. You couldn't spoof that with software alone. You needed someone who understood the underlying biology. Someone working inside the system. He made a list of 11 people. Crossed off 8 of them within 2 hours based on access logs, and the way they held their bodies when he asked them where they'd been 3 weeks ago. He was down to 3 when he walked through the archive section, and felt the augmentation do something strange. Not the subtle hum of guilt, or the bright spike of fear, but something else. Something like recognition. Like a note struck at the exact frequency your bones were already resonating at. The woman at the back terminal looked up when he walked in, and the moment she did, the virus in his blood went very quiet, the way a crowd goes quiet when something has shifted. She was perhaps 30, with a face that suggested she'd spent time in environments she wasn't meant for. Something about the particular steadiness of her eyes, the way she tracked him without performing any of the social rituals people usually performed when an investigator walked into their workplace. Most people either oversmiled or went carefully neutral. She just looked at him, not challenging, not afraid, just present in a way that made everything else in the room feel like backdrop. "Sela," he said, reading her tag. "Sela Voss." Her voice was level. The augmentation told him almost nothing about her, which was itself information. Either she felt nothing, or she felt too much, or she'd learned to contain whatever she felt in a space so compressed it registered as silence. He'd met very few people who could do that. The ones who could, he'd noticed, were usually the ones with the most to contain. He asked her routine questions. She gave routine answers. He asked about the gene lock irregularities in the archive access logs, and she told him the system had been glitchy for the past 3 months, which was true. He'd already confirmed it. He asked about the travel tag anomalies in Sector 9, and watched her face carefully, and saw nothing he could use. Only that faint quality of attentiveness, as if she were listening to something in his questions that wasn't the questions themselves. He thanked her and moved on. He filed a preliminary report that named 2 other employees as persons of interest. He did not mention Sela Voss. He didn't sleep well that first night. The virus was still metabolizing, and it gave everything a strange overtone, the way sounds become louder and more specific when you're running a fever. He lay on the narrow bunk in his transit quarters and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way she'd looked at him. Not as if she recognized him, but as if she recognized something about the situation and had already made a calculation he wasn't aware of. He went back the next day. This time he found her in the corridor between the loading dock and the records office, carrying a stack of physical maintenance logs in a building that otherwise kept everything digital, which meant the physical logs were for something that couldn't be digital. He watched her walk for a moment before she noticed him, and in that moment the augmentation gave him something he hadn't been expecting. Not guilt, not fear, but something closer to grief. The particular quality of someone who has been moving through their life with a specific weight for so long that the weight had become load-bearing. Take it away, and something would fall. You forgot to ask me about Corridor 7, she said before he could speak. Did I? The access anomalies in the archive logs. They map to Corridor 7 more than anywhere else. That should have been in your line of questioning yesterday. He looked at her for a moment. You're either very helpful or you're very good at misdirection. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She shifted the maintenance logs under her arm. You want to see something? He shouldn't have said yes. He knew, in the way you know things that arrive slightly ahead of conscious thought, that whatever she was offering wasn't going to make his job cleaner, or simpler, or faster. The augmentation gave him no specific warning. It never did really. It just showed him what was there. What you did with what it showed you was still yours. He said yes. Corridor 7 was a maintenance access route that ran along the building's outer skin, between the insulated exterior panels and the structural wall. It was half a meter wide and lit by amber emergency strips, and it smelled of insulation compound, and something else he couldn't immediately identify. She moved through it like she'd done it 100 times, which she had. At the far end there was a junction where someone had installed a secondary power tap and plugged into it a small processing array that looked like it had been built from components that officially didn't exist in any of Waypoint 14's inventory logs. Who built this, he asked. I did. She said it without particular drama, the way you say something that's simply true. It takes a standard gene tag sequence and rebuilds the biological authentication layer from baseline templates. It doesn't spoof anyone specific. It creates a valid person who doesn't exist in the system. She paused. The people who use the tags I make, they exist. They just don't exist in the parts of the system that matter to the consortium. He understood then the weight he'd felt in her. The kind of work that makes the people who do it carry themselves at a particular angle, always slightly braced. The people outside, he said. It wasn't really a question. She said. The ones born in the wrong sectors, the ones the system can't accommodate. You know what happens to people who can't get travel clearance in this ring? Stay outside the loading corridors. They sleep in the maintenance bays. They eat whatever the recycling processors reject. Some of them have children, and those children are flagged at birth as non-priority allocation, which means they'll sleep in the same maintenance bays their parents slept in. She looked at him steadily. I make them a way out. Not all the way out, but further. He should have called it in right then. He had a secure comm channel and a direct uplink to Central and a perfectly adequate set of procedural guidelines that covered exactly this situation. Instead, he said, how many, since I started? About 400. She said it simply, still watching him. Some of them made it to the transit rings. Some of them got as far as the outer stations. Some of them, I don't know. The tags expire after 6 months. After that, they're on their own. Something shifted in her expression briefly, before she contained it again. I prefer not to think too carefully about the ones I lost contact with. He looked at the array, at the careful, precise construction of it. Each component chosen for efficiency, nothing wasted, nothing redundant. He thought about the 40 minutes he'd spent watching the city from the transit pod. The gray tiers of the residential blocks. The people crowded at the checkpoints who weren't going anywhere. I'm going to need to document this room, he said. I know, I'm going to need to log the array as evidence. I know. My report will say the array was non-functional, disused, possibly pre-existing infrastructure from a prior tenant. She didn't say anything for a moment. The amber light made everything look like it was already remembered, rather than happening now. Why? She asked. He didn't have a good answer. The virus was still in his blood, and it was doing what it always did, which was make everything clearer than he strictly wanted it to be. He looked at her and felt the particular weight she carried and felt, somewhere in the elevated intuition the consortium had injected into him that morning, that the difference between them was not as large as his job required him to believe. "I'll file the report tonight," he said. "You should know they'll send someone else. Someone without the augmentation, probably. They'll miss things I'd catch, but they'll also find things through different means." "How long?" 6 months. "Maybe 8, she nodded slowly. Not relief, something more complicated. I'll have to rebuild somewhere else. Somewhere with less consistent access logging, he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. The virus, maybe. The door that had opened in him and hadn't quite closed. The Sector 12 maintenance corridors have a 17% uptime gap in their surveillance coverage. I'm not supposed to know that, but it's in the infrastructure assessment I reviewed this morning. She looked at him for a long time. The augmentation gave him nothing he could name. Only the sense of standing at the exact place where something was balanced, and the particular quality of the silence before a balance tips. "You have a family," she said, "back wherever you came from. A son, Jim." He didn't know why he said the name. It came out the way things come out when the ordinary armor you wear isn't quite where you put it. "He's 7. He wants to be a habitat engineer." Something moved across her face. "He's very special." "He is," Cale said. He filed the report that night. He named 2 other employees. He described the Corridor 7 access anomaly as pre-existing infrastructure, consistent with prior tenant usage, no current operational status. He recommended 2 procedural audits and a moderate-level surveillance review. He used language that was technically accurate and structurally misleading, and he was very good at it, which was perhaps the most troubling thing he'd learned about himself that day. He was assigned to Meridian for 3 more weeks. In that time, he interviewed 62 people and filed 14 additional reports, and attended 6 procedural briefings, and ate dinner alone every evening in a canteen that served 2 varieties of reconstituted protein and called them something different each night. He did not go back to Corridor 7. He did not seek out Sela Voss. When they passed in the main corridor on his 8th day, he nodded and she nodded, and neither of them slowed. He thought about her at strange times, not in the way that wants something. In the way that keeps returning to a question that hasn't finished forming. The 400 people who'd made it further. The ones she'd lost contact with. The particular expression on her face when she spoke about them. Not guilt, but something adjacent to it. A weight that comes from caring about outcomes you can't control. On his 15th day in Meridian, he was reviewing transit records in the operations office when a secondary alert came through Central. A travel tag had been flagged at waypoint 9. The biological authentication layer had been checked against the travel history registry and found to present a genetic profile with a 14% overlap with a documented consortium employee. Not a Code 46 violation, that was biological reproduction law, a different department entirely, but a flag in the system for further review. The tag holder was a woman in her early 20s. She had been trying to reach the outer transit rings. She was currently in holding. He looked at the tag number. He pulled the authentication trace. He saw the construction signature in the biological template, the specific way the baseline had been assembled, the precise compression ratio on the microbiome layer. He'd seen it before. In a corridor 8 meters long and half a meter wide, lit amber, smelling of insulation compound. He sat with this for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, he counted. Then he contacted the Waypoint 9 holding facility. He identified himself as the senior compliance investigator for the sector, which was accurate. He told them the tag in question had been flagged incorrectly due to a known calibration error in the authentication readers at Waypoint 9, which had been documented in a maintenance report 3 weeks prior, which was also accurate. He told them the holders should be processed and released. He gave them a case number from the maintenance file, which existed, and which any junior administrator would cross-reference without actually reading the underlying report. The woman was released in 40 minutes. Cale sat in the operations office for a while after, looking at the wall. He was not, he realized, entirely sure when he had started making these decisions. He was reasonably he hadn't made a conscious choice, so much as found himself already in the middle of one. The way you find yourself standing in a doorway, without remembering the walk down the hall. The virus had fully metabolized by then. His ordinary perception had returned, which meant the world was less clear in some ways and more bearable in others. But some things, once opened, don't close entirely. He was pulled off the Meridian assignment 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The message came from Central at 0300. and was flagged urgent, which usually meant something had gone wrong. He read it in his bunk, with the tight, hollow feeling of someone who has known a fall was coming, and still isn't quite ready for it. But the recall wasn't about his report. A different situation had developed in a transit cluster in the outer reach. 7 stations, 11 incidents, a pattern that suggested systematic interference with consortium gene-lock infrastructure. They needed their best reader. They were pulling him from Meridian early. He packed in 20 minutes. He did not go by waypoint 14 on his way to the terminal. He told himself this was because he didn't have time, which was partially true. The outer reach was different. Meridian had been gray and tiered and organized around industrial efficiency. The outer stations were raw, the kind of infrastructure that gets built fast and maintained less, where the original plans have been revised so many times that the revision marks have revision marks, and the actual structure bears only a genealogical resemblance to anything anyone originally intended. The people here were rougher, in the way that things get rough when there aren't enough resources to keep edges smooth. But they moved through their days with a directness he'd rarely felt in the interior rings, the augmentation or not. A quality of people who had never been able to afford the pretense that the system was working in their favor. He spent 2 weeks here. He found what he was looking for. A different operation, different architecture, no connection to Celavos. He filed his reports. He did his job efficiently and without deviation, and when he was done, he sat in a transit lounge and watched people show their papers at the checkpoint and thought about how many of them were real and how many of them were careful constructions that would expire in 6 months. And he didn't think he'd be able to tell the difference anymore, which was either a problem or a correction, depending on where you stood. The message came on a Thursday. It came through official channels, flagged informational, which meant someone had been careful about how they sent it. The subject header was a compliance case number he didn't recognize. When he opened it, there was a single data attachment, no text, no sender identification visible, containing the authentication trace for a travel tag. He ran the analysis. Saw the construction signature immediately. Saw, at the bottom of the attachment, a secondary file. He opened it. It was a photograph. A woman in her early 20s standing on the observation deck of what looked like Outer Station Brev, one of the furthest points in the transit network, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too large and squinting slightly into whatever light source was behind the camera. She looked tired and travel-worn and entirely, precisely, present. Alive in the particular way of someone who had arrived somewhere they'd been trying to reach. There was no accompanying message. He understood that was the message. He sat with that photograph for a long time. He thought about 400 people. He thought about the ones she'd lost contact with, and the particular quality of her face when she spoke about them. He thought about a boy named Jim who wanted to be a habitat engineer. He thought, 400. He didn't intend to go back to Meridian. Circumstances arranged themselves the way circumstances do into a shape that looked like intention without quite being one. A follow-up audit was required at waypoint 14. He was the senior investigator on record for the sector. The assignment came through automated routing. He accepted it. He did not let himself think too clearly about why. She was still there. He saw her from across the main floor before she saw him, and in the second before she looked up. That particular fraction of time when you can see someone who cannot see you. He felt the augmentation, no longer in his blood, but still somehow in the way he looked at things, give him the same quality it had given him the first day. Not guilt, not fear. The weight of someone carrying something that has become structural. She looked up and saw him, and her face did something complicated. The investigator, she said. The counterfeiter, he said. Something very close to a smile. Not quite. He was not supposed to be having this conversation. He was supposed to be in the operations room, reviewing updated access logs, which was where he had told the duty administrator he was going, before he turned the wrong direction in the corridor. He was aware of this. He was also aware that awareness and action are different categories and have always required separate decisions. I got your message, he said. I didn't send a message. No. He looked at her. I know. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor they were standing in had no surveillance gap that he was aware of. He filed that information and didn't do anything with it. The ones I lose contact with, she said eventually. I don't always know. Sometimes I find out later. Sometimes I don't find out at all. She looked at the middle distance. But sometimes I find out they made it. And those are the days the whole thing feels like it might actually mean something. It means something, he said. She looked at him directly then, and the thing she did with face, when she was containing herself, slipped briefly, and he saw underneath it the exact quality of what she carried. Not just the weight of it, but the brightness of it. The particular quality of a person who has chosen something costly and would choose it again. He had interviewed, in 11 years of compliance work, somewhere north of 6,000 people. He had encountered that quality perhaps 4 times. "You came back to file the audit," she said. "Yes, and the audit will find nothing." He thought about this honestly, which the remnant of the augmentation required of him even when he'd rather not. "The audit will find what I report," he said. "What I report will reflect what I found." She studied him for a long moment. "And what did you find?" "A facility in compliance with all current consortium standards," he said carefully, "as they pertain to the documentation I was provided access to." That almost smile again. "Closer this time." "You should know," she said, "that what I'm doing, the scope of it has changed since you were here last. Bigger, different, more systematic. There are others now, not many." "Enough," she paused. "If they send someone without your kind of audit style, it won't be as invisible." He understood what she was telling him. He also understood what she was not telling him, which was everything about the network she'd built since he left. Everything she was protecting by keeping it out of a conversation happening in an unsecured corridor. She was protecting it from him too, just in case he respected that. "The Sector 12 corridors," he said. "Were excellent," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. He turned to go back toward the operations room, where he would review 47 access log anomalies and find 31 of them procedurally insignificant, and classify 14 of them as legacy infrastructure irregularities, and file a report that was technically accurate and structurally generous, and would give Waypoint 14 another 8 months of operational cover. "Investigator," she said behind him. He stopped. "There's a family in Sector 9, a mother and 2 children. They've been waiting for clearance for 7 months. The system keeps flagging an inconsistency in the youngest child's gene record. He was registered in a different zone from his mother during the relocation, and the records never reconciled." She paused. "They're outside. They sleep in the maintenance approach. The youngest is 4. He didn't turn around. He stood in the corridor with the amber maintenance lighting and the smell of recycled air and the sound of the facility going about its ordinary business around them. "Give me a case number," he said. She gave him the number. He walked back to the operations room and pulled the file and sat with it for 11 minutes. And then spent the next 3 hours building a records reconciliation pathway through 4 separate administrative systems, a process that was technically within his authority as a senior compliance investigator, and that no one would review carefully for at least 6 months, at which point the reconciliation would be complete, and the discrepancy would appear to have always been resolved. He filed the audit report at 1800. He took the 1900 transit pod out of Meridian. He did not see her again before he left. He did not need to. The consortium found him 8 months later, not through any single mistake. That was the thing about the systems they built. They didn't need a single mistake. They needed only the accumulation of improbabilities. The pattern that emerged when you mapped every decision that had gone slightly in the wrong direction, every anomaly that had been classified as legacy infrastructure one too many times. They had audit algorithms specifically designed to detect the pattern rather than the individual incidents. He'd known they had these algorithms. He'd built several of them himself in his earlier years. The investigator they sent was young, thorough, and looked at him with the particular quality of someone who has been told they are correcting a significant problem. Her name was Adira Pell. She had dark, precise eyes, and she held herself very straight, and she did not use augmentation, which meant she had to rely on more blunt instruments. Document analysis, surveillance cross-reference, statistical anomaly detection, and she was very, very good at all of them. He watched her work through his files for 3 days before she came to him directly. She came to his office in Central, which he'd been allowed to keep during the review, and she sat across from him and laid a data panel on the desk between them, without preamble. 43 incidents, she said, across 9 facilities spanning 14 months. He looked at the panel. His work was very thorough and she'd found most of it, which meant she was excellent at her job. "The incident at Waypoint 9, she said, pointing to the 3rd entry. "You leveraged a maintenance filing from a different sector to release a tag holder without additional review." "The maintenance filing was accurate," he said. "It was accurate about a calibration error that had no bearing on the authentication anomaly in this specific tag." She looked at him. You know that. Yes. The records reconciliation for the family in Sector 9. She moved to another entry. You used senior investigator authority to force a 3-system reconciliation that technically required a supervisor co-signature. The supervisor co-signature requirement applies to external reconciliations. The pathway I built was technically internal to the compliance databases. Technically. She said the word with the precise weight of someone who has been dealing with technical accuracies for 3 days and has developed feelings about them. 43 incidents, almost all of them individually defensible. Together they constitute a systematic pattern of compliance obstruction in service of an unauthorized network of gene tag forgery. He looked at the data panel. He thought about 400 people. About the photograph of a woman in a too large jacket, standing on an observation deck at the edge of the transit network, squinting into the light. About a mother and 2 children who were no longer sleeping in the maintenance approach. Yes, he said. Adira Pell studied him for a long moment. He'd spent 11 years reading people, and he could see, in her very precise and careful face, a complexity she was working to suppress. She had been doing her job exactly right. She had found exactly what she'd been sent to find. She believed in the system she served, which he respected, because he had once believed in it too, and he remembered what that felt like. You understand what this means, she said. Full compliance review. Asset suspension. Criminal referral for the forgery facilitation. He had looked up the specific provisions 2 weeks ago, when he'd first realized the audit was coming, and memory remediation probably. Full strip, given the scope. She didn't say anything for a moment. The strip is standard for Category 3 violations. Given the scope, yes. Memory remediation. That was the phrase they used. What it meant was, the past 14 months would be surgically removed. Every conversation, every decision, every amber-lit corridor. His wife and son would see him come home from an extended assignment, tired and quieter than usual. And they would not know that he was quieter, because something in him had been scraped clean, and what lived there now was only the space where something had been. He would not remember Jim's name being used as a kind of anchor in a conversation with a stranger who somehow understood why it mattered. He would not remember the photograph. He thought about this carefully. The way you think about something you have only a limited time to look at before it's taken away. The network, he said. What happens to it? It will be identified and dismantled. She said it without evident satisfaction. The primary operator has already been located. He went very still. She was careful, Adira Pell said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't the professional register she'd been using all morning. Something that sounded like it cost her something. But you were the one who knew the audit protocols. You covered for her well. Not well enough in the end. What happens to her? The sentencing provisions for systematic gene tag forgery at this scale. She stopped. Started again. Exile. Outside the covered sectors. Permanent. He sat with that. She keeps her memories, he said. He already knew the answer from the statutory language. He'd read it 3 times. The remediation applies to me because I'm consortium personnel. She's not. Her punishment is exile. Yes. Meaning she would be sent outside, to the desert margins and the maintenance approaches and the recycling processor rows, with every memory of everything that had happened, and he would be sent home with none of it. She would remember. He would not. The system had a particular genius for this kind of asymmetry. He thought about the weight he'd felt the first day. The brightness underneath it. The 400 people. The woman in the photograph squinting into light at the edge of the reachable world. She'd do it again, he said. If you put her back inside tomorrow, she'd start over. Adira Pell didn't answer that. So would I, he said. It surprised him slightly, which meant it was true in a way that had arrived before he'd consciously confirmed it. She looked at him for a long time. The data panel sat between them, with its 43 incidents. Outside the office window, the city was doing its ordinary business. And in the maintenance corridors and transit holds, and recycling approaches that lived underneath the ordinary business, people were sleeping and waking, and making calculations about how far they might get, with the papers they had, or the papers they didn't have. The remediation is scheduled for tomorrow morning, she said. She stood up and collected the data panel with the precise movements of someone who has done everything they were required to do. I'll note in my report that you cooperated fully with the review. Thank you, he said. At the door, she stopped without turning around. The family in Sector 9, she said. The records reconciliation. A pause. It went through. It processed 2 months ago. They're in the transit system. He sat very still. I didn't find it relevant to include in the incident list, she said. and her voice was completely professional. The reconciliation was technically within the authority parameters. Then she left. He spent the evening with his wife and Jim. He didn't tell them what was happening. What would he say? His wife knew he'd been under review. She wasn't a fool. She'd seen the signs. But she didn't know what for. And tonight she was quiet with him in the way that means I know enough not to ask. Jim wanted to show him a model he'd built of a habitat pressure system, small enough to fit in both hands, painstakingly accurate in its mechanics. He sat on the floor and held it carefully, and let Jim explain the pressure compensation valve, while the amber light from the apartment window fell across them both. He put Jim to bed. He sat in the kitchen for a while after his wife fell asleep. He thought about the things that would be gone in the morning. He tried to be precise about them, the way you try to see a room very clearly before you leave it. The corridor. The array built from components that officially didn't exist. Her voice saying 400 without drama, without apology, without any more performance than the facts required. The photograph. The weight and the brightness underneath it, and the specific rare quality of someone who has chosen on something costly and would choose it again. The way she'd looked at him in that second corridor when something slipped and he saw underneath it. The sense of standing at the exact place where something was balanced. He thought, she will remember all of it. She will be outside in the desert in the maintenance approaches, in whatever specific form her exile takes. She will remember the array and the 400 and the one photograph from outer Station Brev. She will remember every conversation. She will remember him, probably, in the complicated way you remember who saw you clearly and didn't do anything simple with what they saw, and she will miss it. She had said, at the end of the last film the world had made of her life, I miss you. He knew this because the statute had explained it clearly. The exile remembers. The consortium personnel does not. The asymmetry was intended as punishment for her. A form of it, he supposed. But sitting in his kitchen in the dark, he thought that there was another way to read it. She would carry it, all of it. The weight and the brightness and the 400 and the family in Sector 9. She would carry it the way she'd always carried things. Compressed to a size that let her keep moving, that let her rebuild somewhere new, that let her start the count again from wherever she was. He thought about 400 people. He thought about one more. He got up and went to his desk and wrote a careful, factual document that used none of the names and all of the structural details. The construction signature, the authentication methodology, the specific compression ratios that made the tags work, the gaps in surveillance coverage he'd memorized from 14 months of infrastructure assessments, the administrative pathways that were technically within authority parameters. He wrote it in language that would mean almost nothing to someone who didn't already understand what they were looking at and mean everything to someone who did. He encrypted it. He routed it through a chain of dead-drop addresses he'd mapped over the years for reasons his official file didn't entirely reflect. He attached no name, no message. She would understand what it was. She would understand that it was not rescue. She didn't need rescue. She needed materials, and he had given her the best ones he had. She would understand that he had done what he could do in the hours he had left, which was give her enough to start the count again from wherever she was. In the morning they would take away the 14 months. He would wake up beside his wife. He would walk Jim to the habitat model on the floor and ask why it was there, and Jim would explain the pressure compensation valve. He would go back to work. He would file reports. He would do his job. But in some maintenance corridor, in some sector he'd never see again. In some amber-lit space, smelling of insulation compound, and the specific determination of someone who has been doing this work for long enough that the work has become who they are, she would be starting over. He thought about her in the desert, in the exile, with all her memories intact. He thought about the specific quality of someone who keeps choosing the costly thing. He thought, 400, and then some, and then more. He went to bed. The morning came the way mornings do. The light arriving before you're ready, the world reassembling itself around you before you've had a chance to prepare. His wife was already up. Jim's voice came from the kitchen, asking about something. The habitat model was on the floor. He looked at it for a moment, its small, precise pressure compensation valve, and felt something he couldn't entirely name. A sense of something just outside his peripheral vision, a shape he couldn't quite resolve. He picked up the model. He held it carefully, the way you hold something that belongs to someone who made it with their hands. The weight of it was real. The craftsmanship was real. Jim came in and started explaining, and he listened. and the amber morning light came through the window, and somewhere out past the city limits, past the checkpoints and the covered sectors and the atmospheric processors, out in whatever desert the exile had carried her to, she was already working. He didn't know this, but he had known it once, and the knowing had left something behind. A ghost of the door that had opened in him, still not entirely closed. She was already working. 400 and counting.